No one heard the train, or the scream before it. Welcome to Fogged Clue. I am your host, Merrin. We're all part of this unfolding tale. Drop your city in the comments. Your words always stay with me. Let's begin. It was the rain that had woken him. A thin, persistent tapping at the window pane above the radiator in the dining room. It wasn't loud, but it had rhythm, the sort of steady drumming that marked out the hours in the grey corners of a Paris morning. Maigret sat with his back to the stove, in shirt sleeves, a pipe resting in the ashtray beside a chipped bowl of chicory coffee. Madame Maigret had left for the market, her umbrella bobbing down the Rue de Turenne 2 hours ago. She had taken her time, as she always did on Thursdays, and Maigret had not asked what she would buy. He preferred to find out from the smells when she returned. He reached for his pipe, tamped it without really needing to, and lit it. The tobacco was damp. Everything was damp. He could feel it in his joints, that slow, creeping chill of an indecisive Paris summer that could not quite admit defeat. It was mid-July, but the stove was still burning. On the wall, the phone gave a dry little rattle, and then fell silent again, a reminder that it might ring but hadn't yet. He was not expecting a call, not from the office, not today. He had finished a small case 2 days earlier, a boy who had stolen a bicycle and returned it a week later with the tires pumped. The report was still on his desk, unsigned. He could go in, but he hadn't. That was the privilege of years of service and a commissioner who knew how Maigret worked, quietly, unpredictably, often better left to himself. He stood, stretched slowly, and went to the window. The street below looked washed out, as though someone had drawn it in chalk and then poured a pail of water over the sketch. A boy with red hair and short pants leaned against the bakery door, tossing a coin and missing each catch by design. On the corner opposite, a woman in a brown cardigan tried to light a cigarette under her headscarf, then gave up. Maigret watched her a moment longer than necessary. She had a way of pressing her shoulders forward, as if shielding herself not from rain, but from being seen. The phone rang, just once. He let it. Then it rang again, and continued, as if the second attempt had found its voice. He crossed to it slowly, more from habit than urgency, and lifted the receiver. Maigret, a man's voice, low and sullen. I was told to call you. Inspector Lognon said you should handle this one. Maigret grunted, but said nothing. There's been a death, at Madame Couche's boarding house, by the tracks near Porte de la Chapelle. What kind of death? A quiet one. The man hung up without another word. Maigret stood there with the receiver still in his hand for a moment, as if trying to place the voice. Not the name, for there had been none, but the tone. It hadn't been frightened or urgent, just tired, like someone who had already decided something before making the call. He looked at the clock on the wall, a few minutes past 11. He fetched his coat, not bothering with the umbrella. The rain had softened into a fine mist by the time he stepped into the street, and the baker's boy was gone. He walked to the station instead of calling for a car. It wasn't far, 20 minutes, maybe less if he didn't dawdle. He had no intention of rushing. The address rang a bell. Madame Couche, a widow, ran a small place out near the rail yard, where the freight trains idled and the pigeons never seemed to leave. He had been there once, years ago, for a missing tenant who turned up drunk in Montreuil 3 days later. As he walked, Maigret's thoughts wandered in that slow, unhurried way that always came before something. Not action. He disliked action, but a shifting in the air. Something was beginning. He could feel it in the silence of the streets and in the way the Seine looked as he passed over it, swollen and brown, but oddly still, as if waiting. The boarding house appeared as he remembered it, a drab 2-story building with a flaking green gate and curtains that sagged with the weight of too many damp mornings. It was wedged between a tobacconist and a defunct cobbler's shop, whose sign had faded to illegibility. The windows looked inwards rather than out, eyes half-lidded against the street. A woman answered the bell. She wasn't Madame Couche, but Maigret didn't ask. Her cardigan was buttoned wrong, and her slippers were damp. She said nothing, just stepped back and let him in. The hallway smelled of boiled potatoes and floor polish. A narrow stair climbed upward on the left, and behind the door to the right came a distant radio voice, tinny and cheerful, entirely out of place. Maigret took off his hat and stepped further in. A man stood at the end of the corridor, beside a closed door. He was thin, wore a clerk's collar, and held his cap in both hands like a schoolboy awaiting reprimand. He looked up and blinked when Maigret approached. "You called," Maigret said simply. The man nodded. "Room 4. It's Monsieur Serre." Maigret paused before opening the door. He didn't ask how the man had died. Not yet. He listened. There was silence behind it. Not emptiness. Silence which was a different thing. The kind of silence that settles in when someone is watching, even if no one is seen. Then, with a deep breath, he turned the knob and stepped inside. And immediately, something felt wrong, not in the way of blood or violence, but in the carefulness of the scene. The bed was made too neatly. The shoes by the radiator had been arranged rather than placed. A single chair stood by the window, slightly turned, and on the floor, beside the small writing table, lay the body of a man who had died, sitting up, and slid sideways with the smallest resistance. He had a coat on, too heavy for July, and his eyes were open, but not surprised. Maigret stood still, letting the air of the room settle over him. He said nothing. He just watched. The rain began again, not loudly, just a soft drumming on the roof tiles. Maigret pulled his coat tighter and lit his pipe. This would take time. It always did. The room held the faint, lingering warmth of someone who had only recently departed. Not just the man on the floor, though his body had not cooled fully, but of someone else. Someone who had taken care to leave things tidy, who had closed the drawer but not locked it, who had wiped something clean but not thoroughly. Maigret remained still near the door, his pipe unlit now, hanging loosely between his fingers. The air was too damp to strike a match, and besides, he was thinking, not of crime, not yet, but of rooms like this one, and men like this one, and the ways in which people try to disappear even as they remain. He knelt slowly, letting his knees creak, and studied the face. "Monsieur Serre," the man had said. The name meant nothing. The face was neither young nor old, mid-50s perhaps. The hair was sparse, combed back neatly, and the skin pale beneath it, not from death, but from long months without sunlight. A man who didn't walk far, who worked indoors, who perhaps lived as quietly as he now lay. There were no marks on the body, no blood, no sign of struggle. The hands were folded over his stomach, though one had slipped slightly open, palm up. His right shoe was scuffed at the toe, and his trousers had a frayed hem where they met the sock. Signs of wear, but not neglect. Someone had cared, at least until recently. He stood, dusted his coat with his palm, and turned to the man still standing in the corridor. "Your name?" "Pommard. Lucien Pommard. I stay on the first floor, across from Madame Couche. I do bookkeeping for a textile firm near Gare du Nord." Maigret nodded. "And you found him?" "This morning. I thought I heard something in the night, a thump. But it rains, you know, and the trains—" Maigret understood. The trains ran all night behind the boarding house. Not quickly, not loudly, but always. A dull, scraping rhythm that blurred dreams and memory. A thump in the night could be a door, a footstep, a shift in sleep. "I knocked on his door around 10, Pommard continued. "He hadn't come down for coffee. That's not like him. He's always the first, always with his little notebook." Maigret raised an eyebrow. Notebook? Yes, well, he wrote things down. Not conversation, never that, but little notes. What he saw, what he heard. He was a quiet man, but he noticed things. Maigret let that hang in the air. He stepped back into the room and opened the drawer of the small writing desk. A sheaf of yellowed paper, blank. A pencil, worn at the tip, but no notebook. He turned again to Pommard. "Where is it?" Pommard looked down, embarrassed. "Gone. I don't know. He always had it with him. Red cover. Spiral binding." Maigret said nothing. The hallway felt narrower now. The smell of boiled potatoes had thickened. Somewhere someone coughed, a dry, high-pitched sound, muffled behind a door. He gestured for Pommard to remain, and descended the stairs slowly, his fingers brushing the wooden railing polished smooth by years of cautious descent. In the kitchen at the back of the house, Madame Couche was chopping onions with unnecessary force. She wore a worn apron stained with something yellow and old. Her face was wide and flat, not unpleasant but hard to read, like one of the ledger stones in Père Lachaise that had been scrubbed too many times. She did not look up when he entered. "So it's true," she said. Maigret nodded. She gestured to the coffee pot. "It's still warm." He poured himself half a cup and sat at the small table near the door. "You knew him?" She shrugged. "No one knew him. He paid on time, never caused trouble, never spoke of family, never left the house unless to post a letter or buy apples." "Apples?" "He ate one every day. Green ones, always bruised. Said he liked them that way." Maigret sipped the coffee. It was bitter and old, but it had heat. He watched her hands as she chopped. Thick fingers, a silver ring on the smallest one. A blue vein ran like a thread from wrist to knuckle. "You think he killed himself?" she asked without turning. "Do you?" "Number men like that don't kill themselves. They fold their socks, they polish their shoes, they close their drawers." "And you?" She stopped then, blade in mid-air. "I open the door when someone knocks. I don't ask questions. Not anymore." Maigret didn't press. Instead, he stood, set the cup down, and walked to the door. Outside, the rain had lightened, but the sky remained a solid grey. The street was quiet. Somewhere nearby a bell rang once, then stopped. He lit his pipe at last, and walked toward the station to call in the body. He'd have Dr. Paul take a look, though he already knew what the report would say. Cardiac arrest, perhaps, natural causes, no signs of violence, but something gnawed at him, not suspicion, not yet, but disquiet. It was the notebook. Men who write things down don't lose them, especially not the kind who fold their socks. He returned just after 2, as the light began to fade, and found the hallway busier. 2 uniformed men had arrived, and the medical examiner was crouched by the body. Maigret stood back, watching without interrupting. When the stretcher came, he moved aside, and the body of Monsieur Serre left as quietly as he had lived, through the narrow hall, past the chipped umbrella stand, and into the rain. Upstairs, room 4 stood open. He walked in again, slower this time, feeling more than looking. A single photograph on the dresser, a street corner, unremarkable. A cat in the background. No, people. He sat in the chair by the window, turned it slightly inward, as it had been before. He imagined the man sitting just so, with his apple, with his notebook, with the faint hum of a distant train passing behind the walls. He closed his eyes and let the room speak, through the faint tick of the radiator, through the tiny scratch where the pencil had worn into the wood of the desk, through the impression on the bed cover that did not match the angle of the body. Someone else had sat there, someone who had not stayed long. He stood and turned toward the door, and there, just beneath the small lip of the wardrobe, something red caught his eye. He bent slowly, lifted it free. A red notebook, spiral binding, the first few pages torn out. He did not open it, not yet. He simply held it in his palm and walked to the kitchen once more. "Who else was here last night?" he asked Madame Couche. She turned to him, the knife still in her hand. "No one. Just the lodgers. Pommard, the girl from Lyon, old Lambert, who never leaves his room." Maigret nodded and lit his pipe again. "Someone sat on his bed after he died." She frowned. "That's nonsense." "No," he said quietly. "It's grief, or guilt, or fear, but not nonsense." Then he turned and climbed the stairs again, the notebook in his pocket, and the soft smell of onions clinging to his coat like a question he had not yet asked. He sat on the edge of the narrow bed in room 4, the red notebook resting on his knee like a thing that had weight, not in grams, but in consequence. Outside, the rain had paused again, leaving the window streaked with moisture, and the view a smudged blur of grey rooftops and the long, oily gleam of train tracks. The hum of a passing locomotive came and went, low and steady, as if pacing the slow turn of Maigret's thoughts. He turned the cover open. The first 3 pages had been torn out cleanly, as if with care, not in haste. The 4th page began mid-sentence, the handwriting small, neat, unhurried. Maigret read in silence. "The girl from Lyon returns late again. Red lipstick, too bright for the hall light. Someone waits outside sometimes, I think. A cough, a shadow under the hedge. She never sees him." The following page. "Madame Couche bought lamb instead of pork. The butcher had raised his prices. She didn't haggle, just nodded. But she was angry. It showed in the way she stirred the soup. And then, Pommard watches her when she climbs the stairs. Not with lust, but with something else. Guilt, memory." The entries continued in that fashion. Observations, fragments. There were no dates, just lines of quiet curiosity and small truths. No conclusions, no speculation, just the things a man noticed when he spent his days watching the same narrow hallway, the same 4 faces, the same cracked linoleum that peeled a little more each week. Maigret paused and leaned back against the headboard. He let the notebook rest in his lap and looked at the ceiling. It was low, with a water stain near the corner, the kind of ceiling that had heard secrets whispered beneath it for decades. He had seen many like it, but not every room held a man who watched in silence and wrote things down without needing to say why. He turned the page. Monday. Pommard received a letter, pale blue envelope. He burned it in the stove. Later, he cried. Another page. Someone entered my room. Not Madame Couche, not Pommard. Something moved. I had placed the apple on the desk. When I returned, it was on the windowsill. The final entry, written in a shakier hand. "I think I may be followed. Or perhaps I'm simply not as invisible as I imagined." Maigret closed the notebook gently and stood. The air in the room had grown heavier, as if the words themselves had thickened it. He slipped the notebook into his coat and made his way back down the stairs, stopping again in the corridor outside the kitchen. The hallway was empty now. The uniforms had gone. The medical examiner's report would arrive in a day or 2, and it would say nothing he didn't already know. But the notebook had changed something. In the kitchen, Madame Couche was ladling soup into a chipped ceramic bowl. The girl from Lyon, he remembered her now, just barely, sat at the table, her eyes rimmed with dark liner, a cigarette burning low between her fingers. Maigret entered, not asking permission, and stood by the wall. "You were seen last night," he said softly. The girl looked up, startled. "Me?" "In the hallway. After midnight. Red lipstick. A shadow outside." She flushed, then laughed quickly, as if dismissing her own discomfort. "I wasn't doing anything wrong. I went out for a cigarette. Couldn't sleep." Maigret nodded. "Was he already dead?" Her eyes widened slightly. "What? Sir, did you know?" She shook her head. "Number I didn't go near his door." "You're sure?" "Yes." "Then who did?" The room fell still. Madame Couche stopped ladling soup but didn't look up. The girl stubbed her cigarette out with more force than necessary. "No one came in," she said quietly. "We don't even lock our doors here, but no one would have—" "He thought someone had," Maigret said. "He noticed an apple moved. He noticed many things." Madame Couche finally looked up. "He was a lonely man with too much time." Maigret exhaled through his nose. "He was a careful man, and something frightened him. Not badly, not enough to run, but enough to begin expecting something." He turned back into the hallway and climbed again to the first floor, this time pausing outside Pommade's room. The door was slightly ajar. Inside, Pommade sat at his desk, a pile of receipts in front of him, but he wasn't adding numbers. He was staring at the wall, his hands folded on his lap, as if he had been waiting for Maigret. "You found the notebook," he said. "Yes." "I thought someone might." "You didn't take it?" Pommade hesitated. "No. But you knew about it." "I lived across the hall. I knew he wrote in it. Sometimes I'd hear the pencil scratching at night." Maigret sat on the corner of the bed. "You burned a letter?" Pommade's eyes widened, not in denial, but in regret. "It was from my sister. Nothing to do with this." Maigret nodded. "He noticed everything, small things. He saw that you watched the girl, that you watched Madame Couche." "I don't— Not for lust. That's not what he wrote. He said it was guilt, or memory." There was a long silence. Then Pommade leaned forward, his voice low. "You think someone killed him?" Maigret didn't answer immediately. "I think someone wanted what he wrote. He never showed it to anyone. Still." Pommade closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them. "He was kind. That's the worst part. He barely spoke, but when he did, he remembered your name, your coffee, your habits. It made you feel seen. That can be dangerous." Pommade looked at him. "Being seen," Maigret said. The rain had started again. He could hear it faintly now against the eaves. "I think he was frightened near the end," Pommade said. "Something changed in him. He became cautious." Maigret stood. "Did you go into his room?" "No." "Did she?" Pommade hesitated. "The girl?" "Maybe. Once. I think she needed aspirin." "And Madame Couche? She always brings the laundry, but never stayed." Maigret turned to the door. "If you think of anything, tell me." He descended the stairs for the third time, slower now, and crossed to the front hall. The clock above the umbrella stand ticked with a hollow echo. The streets outside were still grey. The rain showed no sign of stopping. He stood there, coat on, notebook in his pocket, and thought about the apple. Not the words in the notebook, not even the tone of fear, but the detail. The apple moved from the desk to the windowsill. Not stolen, not bitten, just moved. A small gesture, a moment of quiet panic perhaps, or remorse. Someone had entered that room not to harm, but to look, or to find something, or to say something too late. He stepped out into the street without speaking further. The pavement shimmered with thin puddles, and the trains behind the boarding house moaned softly through the drizzle. It was not murder, not yet, but it was not nothing. The truth, he thought, was still in the hallway, in the girl's cigarette, in Pommade's silence, in Madame Couche's soup. He would wait. They would show him, without realizing they had. Maigret did not return to the Quai des Orfèvres that evening. He walked instead, slowly, without purpose beyond the rhythm of his steps, through the streets near the boarding house, letting the light dim around him, and the mist cling to his shoulders like a shawl of unanswered questions. There were times when too many words clouded the mind, and times, like now, when silence was needed for the truth to surface of its own accord. He passed a cafe where two men played dominoes without speaking. A girl stood in a doorway brushing crumbs from her apron. A tabac had its shutters halfway down, the bell above the door tinkling aimlessly in the wind. He watched it all, but did not enter. Later, back at his apartment, Madame Maigret had set out dinner, but said nothing when he arrived late. He thanked her with a nod, sat down to eat slowly, a stew with carrots and white beans, and afterward, when she brought the coffee, she asked only, "Another one?" He nodded once. She did not press. She never did. But as she cleared the plates, she remarked almost idly, "It's a strange thing, boarding houses. Everyone living so near, and yet not really knowing each other." Maigret looked up. She went on, drying her hands. "You remember when we stayed in Nice that spring? The hotel on the side street? There was a widow across the hall. I saw her only twice, but I still remember her perfume, not her face, just the smell. Something powdery and sad." Maigret smiled faintly. "Yes. And then one night the concierge told me she'd left suddenly, packed everything, but I hadn't heard her. No one had. It was like she vanished between spoonfuls of soup." He didn't reply, but the image lingered. Later, lying in bed, the notebook on the chair beside him, he read through it again. Not for new information. He knew the words now by heart, but for tone, the rhythm of the man's thoughts, the quiet precision of his observations. Sarah had not been looking for trouble. He had been bearing witness. That was what made it dangerous. Morning brought a washed-out sky and the smell of street-swept rain. At the office, he signed 3 reports, ignored 4 memos, and left again before 11. Inspector Lognon stopped him at the foot of the stairs. "They say the man just had a weak heart. Nothing suspicious. You're still on it?" Maigret paused. "Yes." Lognon frowned. "Why? No bruises, no poison, no motive. Because people are hiding too little, and that's worse than hiding too much." Lognon blinked. "That doesn't make any sense." Maigret nodded. "Exactly." Back at the boarding house, the hallway smelled faintly of polish and something floral, too strong to be accidental. Someone had tried to erase a scent. The air told him more than words would. He knocked gently on the girl's door. She opened it in a housecoat, hair pinned loosely. Her eyes were tired. "Inspector." "I won't take long." She stepped back, let him enter. The room was small, with a narrow bed, a mirror propped against the wall, and a cracked mug holding makeup brushes. A suitcase sat under the bed, half-zipped. "You're leaving?" She hesitated. "I thought I might." "Why?" "It's too quiet here." He glanced around. "Was that always a problem?" "Number not at first. You were in Serre's room once." She looked at him quickly. "Only once. He had aspirin. I knocked. He gave it to me, that's all." "But you sat on his bed." Her hands fluttered, brushing at imaginary dust. "I don't remember." He noticed. She stared at the floor. "You moved his apple," Maigret said gently. "Not on purpose, maybe." But it happened. She sat down slowly, her knees close together. "I didn't think it mattered. You were the last one to see him alive." She looked up, frightened now. "No. He looked tired, that's all. I asked how he was. He said fine." Maigret waited. Then she spoke again, voice lower. "He asked me not to come back." "Why?" "He said someone might misunderstand, that people watched." "Who?" "I don't know. He didn't say." Maigret nodded and left her there, not because he was finished, but because he had heard what mattered. She was afraid, but not of him. Someone else had frightened her, quietly, subtly, enough that she wanted to flee. He stepped into the corridor and paused outside the room opposite. Pomades. But he did not knock. Not yet. Instead, he descended once more to the kitchen, where Madame Couche sat with her hands folded in her lap. She looked up as he entered, no longer irritated, just resigned. "You found something?" "A notebook." She gave a brief nod. "You knew it existed?" "Everyone did." He wasn't secretive. He wrote about you. I'm sure he did. Does that bother you? She looked at him, her face still. Would it change anything if it did? Maigret didn't answer. He lit his pipe, watched the smoke drift toward the open window. He said you bought lamb instead of pork, that you stirred the soup angrily. She gave a soft laugh. So he was right. You visited him the day before he died. I brought up his clean linen. He didn't eat dinner that night. She didn't reply. Did you say something to him? Her eyes flicked to the window. I said maybe he should stop watching, that people were starting to talk. And did he stop? He wrote more. Why did it matter to you? She didn't speak for a long time. Then, very quietly, because he saw things I didn't want seen. What things? She raised her head. That no one else here is what they pretend to be. Maigret studied her. There was no malice in her, only fatigue, the long erosion of someone who had kept secrets for years, not grand ones, but those small humiliations that accumulate in rooms like these. He exhaled smoke and stood. Outside the air was still wet, though the rain had stopped. He walked around the side of the building, past the rubbish bins, to the back entrance near the tracks. It was overgrown, the grass flattened in one place, not recently, but habitually. A spot where someone stood often, watching, waiting. He knelt, fingered the damp soil, a cigarette butt, red lipstick at the tip. Not the girl's. She smoked without color. Someone else. He pocketed it. Back inside, he climbed the stairs again and stood at Sere's door. He opened it slowly. The room had not changed. The impression in the bed cover remained faintly visible, and the notebook's absence now felt glaring. He walked to the desk, stared at the blank paper. Then he took a sheet, folded it, and tucked it in his pocket. He would ask someone to examine the indentation beneath the pencil strokes. Perhaps the missing pages had left something behind. But more than that, he needed time. Not action. Not yet. Just time to let the silence work. He returned to the corridor and stood still, as Serre might have, and listened. A kettle boiling downstairs, the creak of someone shifting above, the long, distant sigh of a train. No words, just lives. Breathing, covering, waiting. He would wait with them. That afternoon, the sky held no promise of clearing. The light that filtered through the upper windows of the boarding house was flat and indifferent, the kind of light that did not alter shadows, but erased them altogether. Maigret remained in room 4, standing quietly now, as if the air itself might speak, if only it were given long enough. The red notebook was gone again, returned to his office that morning for analysis, but its presence still lingered, invisible yet persistent, like the outline left behind on a dusty shelf when a book is removed. He listened. A door opened softly upstairs. Footsteps creaked on the floorboards above, slow and even, too careful to be casual. The old man, Lambert, perhaps, the one no one had seen clearly in days. Serre had not mentioned him in the notebook, not once. That, Maigret thought, might have been the most telling detail of all. He stepped into the corridor again, and the light shifted faintly as he passed the stairwell. There was movement below, a shadow glancing off the wall. The girl from Lyon, her coat on, suitcase in hand, was making for the door. He descended after her. "Leaving?" he asked, not unkindly. She stopped, her grip tightening around the handle. "I told you I might. I remember." She looked at the door, then back at him. "I'm not running away. I didn't say you were. I can't sleep here anymore. Every sound feels wrong." He nodded slowly. "Did you speak to anyone else about him? About Serre?" "No. Not even Madame Couche? She doesn't like me." "Why not?" "She thinks I bring attention, trouble. And do you?" Her lips pressed together. "Not the kind she means." Maigret tilted his head slightly. There was someone outside, the night he died, watching. She said nothing. He wrote about it, a shadow beneath the hedge, a cough. Her face went pale, and she adjusted her grip on the suitcase. You know who it was, he said softly. Still she said nothing. Then, there was a man. Not from here. He came twice, never stayed long. What did he want? I don't know. I think he knew Serre from before. Did Serre seem afraid of him? Number not afraid, but wary, like he owed him something. Maigret stepped back slightly, giving her space. Did you tell anyone about the visits? No. Would you recognize him again? A pause. Yes. He nodded once. If you remember anything else, you'll find me. She didn't answer, just turned the handle and slipped out into the rain, the door clicking shut behind her with a sound that felt oddly final. Maigret stood a moment longer, staring at the empty space she had occupied. Then he turned back into the boarding house, moving slowly, feeling the air shift behind him. A boarding house is like a sponge, he thought. It soaks up everything and holds it tightly, until pressed. He found Madame Couche in the parlour, wiping the arms of a sagging chair with a damp cloth. She's gone, he said. Madame Couche didn't stop wiping. Good. She was frightened. She brought it on herself, always whispering, always looking over her shoulder. She said a man visited Serre twice. I know nothing about that. Maigret didn't press, not yet. Instead, he walked into the corridor again, past the row of shut doors, and paused outside Pommard's room. This time he knocked. The door opened slowly, and Pommard blinked at him, bleary-eyed. You've not been sleeping, Maigret said quietly. No. Because of Serre? Because of myself. Maigret entered without being invited, but Pommard didn't object. The room was unchanged, a neat desk, books stacked in an orderly way, curtains half closed against the grey light. You watched him too, Maigret said. Pommard nodded. It was hard not to. You knew he noticed. I think I wanted him to. Why? He understood things I didn't want to say aloud. That we're all here because we're not entirely welcome elsewhere, because we've bent something in our lives and can't quite make it straight again. You ever go into his room? No, but you knew others did. Maybe. The girl once, and perhaps someone else. Lambert. Pommard didn't answer. He rubbed his temple. Have you ever spoken to Lambert? Not in months. Ever hear him walking at night? Yes. Do you think Serre ever wrote about him? A pause. No. Why? Because some people don't need to be written about. They do all their hiding in plain sight. Maigret stood. He's still here? I believe so. Maigret left him there, the silence lingering like smoke, and climbed the stairs to the top floor, where the hallway narrowed and the ceiling sloped. He stood outside Lambert's door. It was the only one with no visible name card, just the faint impression of one that had been torn off, the glue still dark against the wood. He knocked. Nothing. He knocked again, firmer. After a long pause, a voice, gravelly, unused, answered. Yes? Maigret? May I come in? A pause. Then the latch clicked, and the door creaked open a hand's breadth. The room was dark, curtains drawn, air stale, the shape of an old man visible in the half-light, sitting in a worn chair, his shoulders hunched, like they were trying to fold in on themselves. I won't stay long, Maigret said. Just a question or two. The man said nothing. You knew Serre. Still no answer. He never wrote about you, not once. Lambert blinked slowly, eyes rheumy. Everyone else, he observed, but not you. Why? Finally a whisper, because I asked him not to. Why? He had kind eyes. He didn't want to hurt anyone. He saw me once in the corridor, and I told him, no notebooks, not for me. And he agreed? Yes. Maigret leaned against the wall. You came into his room the night he died. I sat with him, Lambert said. Before or after? After. Why? I heard the fall. I opened the door. He was already gone. I sat beside him, because I didn't want him to be alone. He was the only one here who saw me. Really saw me. Maigret studied him. The voice held no tremble of guilt, only loneliness. It was not a lie, or if it was, it came from a place deeper than deceit. You didn't take the notebook? No. Did you see anyone else? I heard the girl, her shoes. She always drags the left one slightly. Maigret nodded. Thank you. He stepped out, closing the door quietly. The hallway behind him felt heavier now, but clearer. The girl had gone. Pommard was drowning in his own silence. Madame Couche was stewing in something older than truth. And Lambert, he had only wanted someone to see him. Maigret returned once more to room 4, the room where the apple had been moved, where the notebook had disappeared, where a man had written too carefully and died too quietly. He stood still in the center of the room, the floor cold beneath his soles, and let it all settle again. Then he said aloud, though no one was there to hear, it wasn't what he wrote. It was who he was writing it for. And with that, he reached into his coat, removed the page he had taken from the desk, the blank one, and tilted it toward the light. Very faintly, beneath the surface, a groove from a pencil, not a word, a shape, a name, and the beginning of something deeper. The name on the page was faint, barely more than an impression left by the weight of a hand and a soft pencil, but it was there, traced like a shadow into the grain of the paper. Maigret tilted it toward the window again, letting the dull afternoon light pick it out. René Caillard. The handwriting was careful, the formation of each letter deliberate, suggesting not a casual mention, but a name written with purpose. It was not one Maigret recognized, but it had the feel of something half familiar, like a song heard long ago and forgotten until the tune surfaced unbidden. He folded the paper again and slipped it into his inner pocket, then returned slowly down the stairs, passing each door as if retracing Serre's own final days. The girl's room, now empty, Pommard's, closed and silent, Madame Couche's, half open, with the sound of a radio murmuring inside. There was nothing overtly wrong in any of it, and yet, like Serre's notebook, the place felt too arranged. It was as if the truth here did not resist being seen. It merely waited to be noticed. At the corner cafe, he often used as a halfway point between thinking and acting, Maigret took his usual seat near the window and ordered a beer, untouched for nearly 10 minutes as he smoked, and watched the rain return in a fine mist. The page from Serre's desk lay folded beside the ashtray, the name echoing in his thoughts. He finished the beer slowly, paid without speaking, and walked the remaining blocks to the Quai des Orfèvres, where a thin clerk behind the files counter perked up when he entered. "Something I can help with, Chief Inspector?" Maigret placed the slip of paper on the counter. "I want everything we have on René Caillard." The clerk took the paper with one hand and reached for a file drawer with the other. He paused. "Is it a common name?" "I don't think so." "Occupation?" Maigret thought for a moment. "Let's start with anything recent. Any records, even minor, traffic, immigration, civil complaints?" The man nodded and disappeared into the back. Maigret lit his pipe and waited. It was 20 minutes before the clerk returned with a thin file and a raised eyebrow. "Only one that matches this name. Age 57, former station accountant, fired from SNCF 5 years ago for unexplained absences and accounting discrepancies." Maigret took the folder and flipped it open. There was a photograph, a narrow face, high forehead, eyes set slightly too close together. A man who had once been trusted with figures and had broken that trust quietly. Not embezzlement, not theft, just absence, as if he'd begun to drift from his own life. There's more, the clerk added. He was questioned last year in connection with a fraud case involving pension paperwork, but nothing stuck. Lived near Porte de la Chapelle. Maigret looked up. Where? The clerk consulted a slip. Rue des Batignolles, number 19, top floor. That was only 3 blocks from Madame Couche's boarding house. He closed the file without a word, tucked it under his arm, and left. By the time he reached number 19, the rain had become steady, washing the edges of the pavement into a soft blur. The building was old, the facade cracked and water-stained, a bell pull that didn't ring but groaned. Maigret entered without. Announcement. The stairwell smelled of damp wood and old varnish. A small, frightened dog barked behind one of the doors on the first landing, but no one answered it. At the top floor, the landing was narrow. There were only 2 doors. One was open a crack. He knocked softly. Nothing. He pushed it open. The air inside was cold, untouched. No fire in the grate, no sign of movement. It wasn't abandonment, not yet. But it was absence, the kind that came with leaving in a hurry. A cup half rinsed in the sink, a pair of socks drying on the back of a chair, but no coat on the hook, no suitcase. A ledger lay open on the table, numbers partially filled in. In one corner, a slip of paper folded twice over, with a list of 4 names. He read them slowly. Serre, Couche, Pomard, Elise. No surname for the last. He took the slip and turned back, crossing the room once more, and on the small end table beside the window, something else caught his eye. A matchbox from a cheap hotel in Montreuil, and beneath it, a tiny white square with a phone number scrawled in red pencil. It meant nothing yet, but like everything else, it would mean something in time. Back at the Quai des Orfèvres, he requested a trace on the phone number and ordered a quiet lookout placed on the building. Caillard had left too recently to be far, and people like Caillard, who once worked in ledgers and then slipped through cracks, did not vanish cleanly. They left small trails, loose ends, receipts folded in coat pockets. That evening, he returned to the boarding house just as Madame Couche was clearing away the remnants of a dinner he hadn't been invited to. She looked up, eyes weary. You again? I found a name. Caillard. She didn't flinch, but she didn't meet his gaze either. He knew Serre, Maigret said, her lips pressed together. He knew you. Still nothing. And Pomard. She said nothing for a long time, just kept folding a tea towel with exaggerated care. Finally she spoke. I knew a Caillard, years ago. In what capacity? He lodged here, briefly, before the girl, before Serre, and? He made everyone uncomfortable, something in his manner, like he was watching for something but pretending not to. He left without saying goodbye. Did Serre know him then? I don't know. I think so. Did you? She looked up then. He frightened me, but not in the usual way, not with threats, with patience. Maigret nodded. He was an accountant, fired, investigated for fraud. She gave a bitter laugh. That sounds about right. Did he return recently? Her hesitation answered before her mouth did. I didn't let him in, but yes, he waited near the tracks. Twice, maybe more. I saw him from the window. The girl said nothing, but I know she knew him too. Was Serre afraid of him? She exhaled slowly. Serre wasn't afraid of anyone, but he was tired, and tired men don't. Fight! Maigret stepped back. That's all for now. She turned away, her shoulders heavy. Outside, the rain had slackened again, but the night was no warmer. He lit his pipe and stood near the gate, letting the wind pass through him. In the notebook, Serre had written of shadows, of a cough outside, of a figure beneath the hedge. But he had never named Caillard, not outright, only an indentation, a ghost of graphite pressed into paper, because naming something made it real. And some men, Maigret thought, are not ready to make things real, not even for themselves. But now the name had shape, and it was circling back. By morning, the phone number had come back. It was registered to a tobacconist in Montreuil, an older man, retired railway clerk, who had taken to renting the upstairs rooms to those who didn't ask for receipts. The number, he said, belonged to a tenant who had stayed for just under a week, paid in cash, and left 3 nights ago without giving a name. But the description was enough. Narrow face, high forehead, eyes close set and darting. It was René Caillard, without question. He had carried with him a valise and a folded newspaper. He spoke little, smoked too much, left in the rain. Maigret thanked the tobacconist and hung up, then stood at the window of his office for a long while, watching the Seine drift past the quay as if it too were waiting for something to be decided. There was no formal charge, no forensic evidence, no confession, no clear crime, only the kind of death that might be mistaken for natural, unless you had listened to the way people talked around it, and around Caillard. What made it worse was the ordinariness of it all. A dead man in a quiet room, whose only weapon had been observation. A forgotten accountant who reappeared, not to kill with force or plan, but to unsettle. And the rest, Madame Couchet with her brittle pride, Pomard and his old silences, the girl who had vanished into the rain, each one orbiting around the blank center that Serre had left behind. He took the file again and leafed through it slowly, searching not for something new, but for what had been there the whole time and hadn't struck him until now. Caillard's dismissal from the SNCF had not been contested. He had simply stopped showing up. But buried in the margin of one report was a name, supervisor notified, J. Serre. At the time, Serre had held a minor clerical role at the same office, the kind no one remembered and few cared about. But he'd been the one who reported Caillard's absences. That, Maigret thought, had likely been the beginning. He lit his pipe and walked out of the building, leaving the file open on the desk. He didn't take a car. The boarding house was close, and the sky had cleared just enough to soften the air. The scent of last night's rain still caught in the gutters. As he walked, a memory returned, of his early years in the force, before he had earned the weight of his silence. A domestic dispute in a courtyard flat. A man who strangled his wife, not out of rage, but because she had written a letter he had never been allowed to read. It had taught him that sometimes truth was not what killed. It was the fear of being named. At the boarding house, the atmosphere had shifted. The curtains were pulled tighter. The hallway smelled of damp rugs and coffee that had been left on too long. He didn't knock at Pomard's door. He knew the man would already be waiting. The door opened before he reached it. Pomard looked paler than before, the kind of pale that came from something internal unraveling, not illness, but conscience. "You've found him, haven't you?" he said, voice barely above a whisper. "I know who he is. And you know why? I think I do." They sat facing each other in silence for a long minute, the only sound the faint rumble of a train somewhere behind the building, passing like a breath held too long. "I was there when Caillard came," Pomard said finally. "I didn't want to admit it, but I saw him." "When?" 2 days before Serre died. He waited outside. Serre didn't open the door for a long time, but he let him in. They spoke for maybe 20 minutes. And afterward? He didn't say much, just looked tired, sad. I asked if he wanted a drink. He said no. Did he tell you what Caillard wanted? Forgiveness, or maybe permission? Maigret frowned. For what? For blaming him, I suppose. For the ruin of things. For seeing too much. That was always Serre's way. He didn't judge. He just noticed. And that made people feel exposed. Did Serre seem afraid? Number not exactly. But not calm either, like he knew something had come full circle. Maigret leaned forward slightly. Did he mention the notebook? Pomard hesitated. He said he might stop writing in it. But he didn't. No. Maigret stood. Did Caillard return? I think so. The night Serre died. I thought I saw him from the stairs, just a shape at the door, but I couldn't be sure. He nodded. Thank you. At the foot of the stairs, Madame Couche waited as if she had heard the whole thing. She said nothing at first, just straightened a lampshade that didn't need it. He never forgave him, she said at last. Who? Serre? He wanted to, I think, but he couldn't. Because of the dismissal? Because of what came after. Caillard's wife left him. He started drifting, lost his place, his sense of order, and Serre felt responsible, though he shouldn't have. He'd only done what was right. But sometimes, Maigret said, doing what's right leaves the worst kind of mark. She gave a sad smile. He told me once that seeing truth was like watching paint peel. It didn't make a sound, but it left everything ugly underneath. He nodded, stepping outside into the courtyard. The hedges had been trimmed recently. The patch where Caillard used to stand was now empty, the earth hardened by too many footsteps. That evening, Maigret returned to the station, where a telegram waited. Caillard had been spotted at the Gare de Lyon, alone, looking lost, then boarding a train south. No ticket taken, no luggage found. Just a man with a coat too large for him and no destination. There would be no arrest, no formal charges, just a report. And maybe, in time, a fading folder placed quietly in the archive, under cases unresolved not by lack of facts, but by the absence of what anyone could call a crime. Maigret wrote for an hour at his desk, pipe cold between his teeth, fingers moving slowly, pausing often. He described the notebook, the missing pages, the name in graphite. He mentioned Pomard, the girl, Madame Couche, Lambert, the old man who sat by the body, because he could not bear to let it be alone. But he did not mention Caillard by name. Instead, he wrote, "There are some men whose guilt is not in what they do, but in how they return, whose shadows fall long even when their steps are small." And when he put down his pen, the room felt still. Not because anything had ended, but because everything that mattered had passed through silence and been heard. By the next morning, the city had dried slightly under a brittle sunlight that looked warmer than it felt. A sharpness lingered in the air, not quite winter, not quite spring, the kind of cold that slipped down collars and made windows look cleaner than they were. Maigret sat at the café near the canal, with his pipe resting unlit between his fingers, the glass of beer untouched beside him, watching the barges drift sluggishly along the water. He wasn't thinking in the usual sense. The case, if it could even be called that, had settled somewhere inside him like sediment at the bottom of a long-held bottle. The surface was still, but the weight was there. He hadn't slept well. Not from restlessness, but from a sense of something unfinished. Caillard was gone, or at least beyond reach, and Serre was dead by what any doctor would call natural causes. Yet no one in the boarding house would say it had been peaceful. No one had used the word. Not the girl before she left, not Pomard, certainly not Madame Couche. That, more than anything, had stayed with him. There was grief, and there was disquiet. What they felt was the second. He finished the beer slowly, left a few coins under the glass, and walked back toward the station. Not because he needed to be there, but because it was the only place where the story still felt close to its edges. The streets were ordinary again. The bakery was open. A delivery boy leaned against his bicycle, eating from a bag of warm rolls. A mother scolded her son too gently to be effective. Life had resumed. But the boarding house, he could still feel it behind him, as if it moved slowly across the map, even when he turned away. He didn't return there immediately. Instead, he stopped by the archive room and pulled out Serre's original employee record. It was thin, a man who left little behind him in institutions. But there, in the final column, was a single notation in red pencil: voluntary departure following review, dated 1 year after Caillard's dismissal. That, Maigret thought, was important. Serre hadn't been forced out. He had left on his own, after some quiet reckoning, as if he had finished something, or failed to. The red pencil stayed in his mind. He returned to the small slip of paper he had taken from Caillard's room. Serre, Couche, Pomard, Elise. No surname, and the name hadn't come up again. But something about it itched, a loose thread in the corner of the fabric. He went down the corridor and knocked once on the door of the telephone clerk, who handled older listings. Within minutes, they had run a quiet trace on the name. One result. A woman named Elise Pomard, sister to Lucien, died 5 years ago in a convalescent home in Suresnes. Maigret folded the slip and went back to his office. He sat for a long time, watching the afternoon settle. Then he left again, this time walking to the boarding house with no questions prepared, no formal intention, only instinct. He found Pomard standing at the window of his room, looking down at the street below. When Maigret entered, the man didn't turn. He just spoke in a voice low and resigned. "I thought you might come back. I found her name." Pomard nodded slowly. "Elise? Your sister?" "Yes. Caillard wrote it. In the corner of a page. No context." "There wouldn't be." Maigret waited. "I was the one who brought her here," Pomard said quietly. "After her third breakdown. I couldn't afford anything better. She had spells, of silence, of sudden anger. People talked. They always talk in buildings like this." "She lived here?" "For a little while. On the second floor. She kept to herself. Serre helped, brought her meals, made sure she took her medicine when I couldn't. He was kind." "And Caillard?" Pomard's hands clenched on the windowsill. "He was here once, long before. They'd been involved, years ago, before her illness. He didn't handle it well. Abandoned her when things became difficult, left without so much as a word." "He knew she was here?" "I think so. I don't know how. But when she died, I saw his name in the guest book at the cemetery. No note, just a signature. I never told Serre. But he knew. Of course he did. He noticed everything." Maigret took a slow breath, the air in the room stale and oddly still. "You think Caillard came back because of her?" "No," Pomard said. "He came back because he had nothing left, and he wanted to know whether anyone still remembered him, whether his shadow had lasted." Maigret nodded slowly, and Serre gave him nothing. Not anger, not forgiveness, just silence. That's what hurt him most. "And the notebook?" "He never meant to use it as a weapon, but it frightened Caillard all the same. He couldn't bear the idea of being written down, reduced to observation, like a moth pinned under glass." Maigret stood. "You never told anyone?" "There was nothing to tell." He left the room without saying goodbye. It wasn't necessary. Outside, the sky had dimmed again, the air thick with the scent of a storm that might or might not come. The day was closing in, and the lights were beginning to blink on across the street. In the kitchen, Madame Couche was humming something under her breath, something minor and vaguely off-key. He didn't interrupt her. He stood in the hallway one last time, looking at each door. The girl's room, still vacant. Serre's, untouched. Lamber's, silent. Pomard's, now dark. Rooms like drawers in an old cabinet, each containing a life, a few secrets, a great deal of waiting. That night, back in his apartment, Maigret sat with his pipe unlit and the last note from Serre's notebook resting on the table. The final page, slightly smudged, just 3 lines. "He came back. I said nothing. That was enough." Maigret read it again, then folded it away and turned out the light. There would be no arrest, no formal inquiry, no charges, just the knowledge, quiet and unprovable, that a man had returned to a place he'd once wounded and found, in that return, the kind of reckoning that leaves no fingerprints. And in the dark, Maigret thought of Serre, sitting by the window, writing his notes, watching lives unfold one flaw at a time, and wondered whether, in the end, being seen had been enough. In the morning, the city moved as it always did, unconcerned with what had or had not been resolved. Deliveries were made, shops opened, buses hissed against the curb. From the window of his office, Maigret watched a man carry a bundle of newspapers across the square, with the loose, unhurried stride of someone who had done the same thing for decades. Nothing in the street below suggested that anything unusual had occurred. No tragedy, no grief, no confession folded into the quiet corners of a room. And yet the weight of the previous days still pressed behind his eyes, low and steady. He lit his pipe without much pleasure and glanced at the folder still resting on the edge of the desk. Serre, not a suspect. Not a victim in the official sense. Just a man who had lived quietly and died without struggle, surrounded by people who had tried not to see what he saw. The file would remain thin. 1 page, perhaps 2. His death wouldn't be flagged. There would be no red stamp, no photograph, no court date, just an index card and a number. But Maigret couldn't close it. Not yet. He thought again of the last 3 lines from Serre's notebook. He came back. I said nothing. That was enough. They weren't an accusation. They weren't even a warning. They were a man's final ledger entry, written not in bitterness, but in understanding. A quiet accounting. It had been days now since Caillard was seen boarding the train. The lookouts reported nothing since. There was no destination, no pattern. Just a face seen once, then gone. Maigret didn't chase him. There would have been no point. The pursuit of guilt wasn't what mattered here. It never had been. What lingered was smaller and more persistent than that. The tension that fills a hallway after a door is closed. The silence that grows louder in the absence of denial. By noon, he was back at the boarding house. The smell of boiled cabbage greeted him before the door had fully opened. Madame Couche, as always, was in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, face half flushed from the heat of the stove. She barely glanced at him. He wouldn't have liked it, she said plainly, stirring her pot. Maigret didn't ask who she meant. He liked clear flavors, apples, hard rolls, black coffee, the kind of food that tells you what it is. He nodded slowly. Did you ever see what he wrote? No. Did you ever ask? I didn't have to. He wasn't writing about scandal. He was writing about people, their angles, the way they shifted when no one was looking, the way they lied without words. And yet he frightened them. She dropped her spoon and faced him fully. Not because of what he knew, because of what he didn't say. He could have reported Caillard. He didn't. Why not? She gave a tired shrug. What would have been the point? He already knew the man had been hollowed out by his own shame. That was the punishment. Maigret didn't answer. He turned from her and climbed the stairs one final time, this time without stopping at any of the doors. He went straight to room 4. The bed had been stripped. The desk was bare. Only the imprint of the chair legs remained on the floor where Serre had always sat. There was no sound in the room, no voices downstairs, no trains passing by at that moment. He walked to the window and looked out. The hedges were fuller now, trimmed neatly, the path beneath them no longer visible. Rain had softened the earth again. It would be easy now to believe that no one had ever stood there night after night, watching a building that refused to watch back. He turned and sat on the bare mattress. For several minutes he remained still, letting the quiet press in around him like a slow tide. This, he thought, was how Serre had lived, not hidden, but absorbed. Listening, noticing, carrying the weight of the things others wanted forgotten. And in the end, it had not been malice that had killed him. It had been disappointment, the slow erosion of meaning in a world that refused to see itself clearly. He reached into his coat and unfolded the last sheet from Serre's notebook, the one with the final words. He read it again, not for confirmation, but for rhythm. The lines didn't give answers, they gave shape, and sometimes, he knew, that was the closest thing to truth one could hope for. Downstairs, the front door opened, a familiar creak, and a man's slow, heavy steps entered the hallway. Maigret recognized them before the voice came. "I didn't think you'd be here." It was Pommard, still in the same brown overcoat, sleeves slightly too long. His eyes were red from lack of sleep. "I was just leaving," Maigret said, standing. Pommard stepped into the room but didn't sit. He looked at the bed, at the chair, at the clean desk. "It doesn't feel the same anymore. It never does. I keep thinking, if I'd said something, if I'd warned him. He already knew. I could have done more." Maigret shook his head. He wasn't looking for protection. He was watching for the end of something, not to stop it, just to understand it. Pommard nodded. "I think that's what frightens me." "Why?" "Because he saw us, not just me, all of us, and didn't turn away." Maigret looked at him, then turned back toward the door. "Do you think it mattered?" Pommard asked quietly. "That he wrote it all down?" Maigret paused in the doorway. "To him it did. That's enough." He left without further words, the sound of his shoes echoing once down the narrow stairs. Outside, the air was brisk. The sun had sunk low behind the rooftops, throwing long shadows across the street. He lit his pipe, more from habit than need, and began the walk back toward the station. By the time he reached the bridge near the canal, the lights had come on in the bakeries, the cafes, the shops with their coloured awnings. Laughter spilled out from somewhere behind a curtain, the clink of plates, the murmur of radios, life moving forward. At the Quai des Orfèvres, he returned to his desk and placed the sheet of paper, Serre's final words, into the back of the file, not to archive it, not yet, just to let it rest. He sat a while longer in the dim room, watching the shadows gather at the corners. He thought not of Caillard, nor of guilt, nor even of the girl who had disappeared so quietly she might never be remembered. He thought only of a man who had watched the world closely until it wore him out. And in that stillness, Maigret understood what he had always suspected, that the deepest mysteries were not solved by force or confession, but by waiting, until the silence became full enough to speak. The following morning came with a light wind and the first reluctant flicker of spring in the air, not in warmth, but in the looseness of it, the way it moved through the streets without the heaviness of the past week's rain. Maigret sat at the long table in the small café near the canal, a cup of coffee in front of him, and the morning paper folded in half beside it, unread. He was not waiting for news. He was waiting for time to settle around the story, as dust settles around furniture after a house has been abandoned. The weight of it no longer pressed on him, but the shape remained. It always did, in these quiet endings. He had spoken to no one about what he knew, not to the commissioner, not to Lognan, not to any clerk waiting with forms to be signed. The death had been ruled natural. There was no criminal record, no manhunt, only a man's quiet passing in a boarding house near the tracks, and the small shock-wave it left behind in the lives of those who had passed him on the stairs and avoided his eyes in the hallway. But it had been enough. At the Quai des Orfèvres, he had filed a report that said only what it needed to, that René Caillard had visited Serre, that Serre had kept notes, but not to blackmail or expose, that no violence had occurred and no charges were necessary. The rest, the heart of the matter, had not gone into the report. It never did. What would it have said? That a man who had once failed someone came back to the scene of that failure to be seen again, and that the man he had failed offered no punishment, only the unflinching reflection of memory? Maigret had understood it too late, not because it was hidden, but because it was too human to be obvious. Seri had not feared Caillard. He had not hated him. What had exhausted him in the end was the quiet weight of what people carry when they refuse to speak of what hurt them. Watching Caillard reappear, older, smaller, a man reduced, had not unsettled him. It had confirmed something, that the pain had outlived its reason, that guilt could rot a man faster than justice ever would. The red notebook had been returned to Maigret from the lab, now catalogued and placed in an envelope at the back of the file drawer. The indented name, the final entries, the margins filled with quiet observances of small cruelties and gestures of kindness, none of them damning, only true. That was what gave the writing its weight. Pomard had remained at the boarding house. He still took his coffee early, and still walked without hurry down to the post-box near the tobacco stand. But he had begun, quietly, to speak more, not to confess, but to exist. Madame Couche had gone back to her routines with a sharpness Maigret recognized, the kind that masked a softness she would never admit. And Lambert, the old man upstairs, had begun opening his window again in the afternoons. Even the girl, though gone, had left her absence behind like the outline of a chair removed from a room. People still paused outside her door, even when they said they weren't thinking of her. It had not been justice, but it had been resolution. Maigret drained the last of his coffee and rose, the weight of his coat familiar on his shoulders. As he stepped into the street, the wind pressed against him, cool and clean. He didn't return to the office immediately. He walked, slowly, unhurried, past the warehouses, past the train yard, until he stood again by the low wall near the tracks behind the boarding house. Nothing marked the spot, no plaque, no grave, only the soft indent in the earth where someone had once stood, watching the windows above. Maigret lit his pipe, took a single drag, and let the smoke rise slowly. Then he turned and walked away. 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 Walked away.